self-perception, surely it is that we humans are rational beings, right? We look at ourselves, we look at a sea anemone, we think, well, that guy can't make a very good pro-con list, can he, right? We feel very rational comparatively. And again, we do have that ability, right? We can engage in negotiation, we can prioritize, we can collaborate, make complex plans, do lots of things that require this higher level of thinking that many of our companions in this creative world cannot do. But what science is increasingly finding out is that we utilize those rational abilities a lot less than we think. Many of our decisions, even though they feel rational to us, are actually driven by non-rational things like impulse, habit, and desire. Of course, that's not how we view ourselves. We see ourselves taking in information, weighing the pros and cons, and moving toward the best choice that reflects our values. But science tells us that's sort of an illusion, or maybe not an illusion, better said, a half-truth. We don't just take in information and then express it out in action, right? Because if we did, we would all be making progress on an even slope toward all of our financial, fitness, emotional, and spiritual goals, right? Because that's the rational thing to do. But we don't do that. We follow our impulses. We're driven by habit, right? We eat the cookie. We skip our workout. We buy something we don't need. We doom scroll over on our phone even though we know that's not good for us. We yell at our kids sometimes. It's really real. At least that's what the scientists say. I'm sure none of you have these problems. You're all very rational. In his book, You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit, which is the inspiration for this series, philosopher James K.A. Smith has a different way of describing this reality. He writes that we tend to think of ourselves as thinking things. He says, what's a human? We tend to say a human is a thinking thing. We tend to imagine that thinking is the primary way we interact with the world and with others. We think about it. And this preconception informs a lot of what we imagine we are doing when we go about the world. What are we doing when we go to school? We're putting knowledge in the empty box of our minds so that we can get it out later when we're rationally acting in the world, right? That was the predominant educational model for quite some time. What are we doing when we come to church? We're getting information about what our values should be from the person in the robe up there in that pulpit, right? And so that we can encounter a situation in real world, check it against what our values are, and then make the right choice. But Smith says, and science would agree with that, that's not actually an accurate portrait of who we are and what we do. Despite 500 years of thinking that maybe René Descartes was right, we're not essentially thinking things. We're actually loving things, is Smith's view. We love things, and we move toward the things we love in a way that might be called worship. Now, Smith is clear this is not a choice whether or not to worship. It is in our nature to express our loving thingness. The choice is about what to worship, about what direction to move our love toward. Now, of course, as a Christian, Smith believes that we reach our ultimate fulfillment and harmony when we direct our love toward the Creator, toward the sacred. But he acknowledges that doing that is not necessarily second nature. We have to habituate ourselves to direct our attention toward the holy, which is why a lot of us are here, right? In worship and in prayer. It's like a workout for our attention, a habit formation process for our souls. Now, interestingly, he says the same thing about virtue. How do we develop virtue? In essence, the habit of doing or being good, being compassionate, being just. I mean, clearly we don't just think about it. In the same way that I can't just think my way into stronger core muscles, I can't just think, I'd like to be a more honest person and then expect that to change my behavior. I actually have to do it. I have to practice it. I have to embody it. Probably have to fail a bunch of times and then try again. And to repeat it until I don't have to think about it at all. Right? That's when it moves into the category of virtue, when we don't have to think about it at all. So maybe think about this. Maybe if someone asked you, what do you value? You would say, I value forgiveness and compassion. But for this perspective, you have to then ask yourself, have you forgiven anybody this week? Have you made recompense for your wrongs this week? Have you reached across pain to reconcile with somebody? Have you given your love to someone in need even if they didn't deserve it? If not, then you may not be practicing the virtues you know in your mind that you value. Does that make sense? Yeah. This is not to make anybody feel bad, right? Virtue is really difficult. It takes work and attention. But I think it's such an interesting thing to consider, right? As part of what has drawn us all here. How do we habituate ourselves to virtue? What virtues are we habituating ourselves to? Are they the ones we really want? Or other ones that have been sort of fed to us by the culture in which we live? Particularly, and this is my question, unfortunately the kids didn't answer it, so I'm going to have to end the sermon here. How do we habituate ourselves to the virtue of peace? That's a huge question. How do we practice peace? How do we practice peace in our own individual lives, in our communities? This is really challenging. And 1 Timothy is such an interesting text to consider in relationship to that question. And the answer it has to that is pretty complicated and a little bit uncomfortable. We've really got to do some kind of grappling, which you know I like grappling, so we're going to go ahead. I mentioned last week that the pastoral epistles, namely the letters 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, have a particular slant, which seems to be encouraging the church to fit in better with the broader culture of that time. So modern biblical scholars believe that though these letters are attributed to Paul, they were most likely written much later, possibly as late as the first half of the 2nd century. Now, this was a time when the church was continuing to grow and become more established, but also a time when the church was the subject of significant persecution by the Roman state. So you can imagine that it made sense in that very precarious moment for Christian leaders to encourage their followers to fit in, right? To make nice, to not stand out so much or attract attention, because doing that could be really dangerous for them. You see this in the text we read this morning, although maybe you didn't hear it that way. Pray for all the authority figures. Pray for anybody who has any kind of power anywhere around you, anybody that's in authority doing anything. Pray for that person, admire that person, be kind to that person, do nice things for that person, and you will get to live a quiet and peaceful life. Okay, that's really good advice, especially if the authority figures around you have a penchant for feeding people like you to lions. Okay, does that make sense? Right? Context is really everything right here. And as an aside, you can make the same set of connections for the many directives in the pastoral epistles that seem to be reinforcing really strict patriarchal gender norms, right? These people were trying to fit in most cases for their own survival. In a Roman world defined by very strict patriarchy, the best way to do that was not really to have women apostles like wandering around expressing their spirit-given gifts as they had been doing in the earlier witnesses to the life of the church. So that's kind of where this is. And then the question is like, what do we do with all this? That's always a question, right? We are in a much different context. And some of us sitting here actually are the authorities, not the persecuted minorities of our time. So how do we respond to the teachings here? How do we practice peace here in this time and place? Do we make nice with authorities that don't truly reflect our values? That doesn't feel quite right. Do we simply pray for those in power, rejecting any hope of active peacemaking and justice work? That also doesn't seem quite appropriate. I've been thinking about this all week. Now, I'm hoping you're going to be thinking about this all week. Come back and let me know. Like, what's the invitation here? How is this inviting us to habituate ourselves into rhythms of peace? And of course, I think about forgiveness and reconciliation that were part of the habit of the early church, habits of humility and self-sacrifice. But the more and more time I spent listening to 1 Timothy, a question kept coming to my mind, and this relates the most to those of us who experience some degree of power or privilege in our setting. And the question that I kept thinking was this: who in our world is forced to make nice with us in order to survive? Who in our world, or even in our neighborhood, is forced to affirm us, pray for us, or make us feel good in order that they can live a quiet and peaceful life? Like, maybe that's the real question that we peacemakers must have in mind when thinking about the habits we want to develop. I was thinking about that question, and of course, the vulnerable in our midst came to mind, right? All the people who must live off our charity, which they know can be given or taken away in an instant based on our mood. I think about those in service roles all around us who survive or thrive based on our patronage and anonymous internet reviews. I think of all those out there who are laboring to bring us food and other necessities, but who still somehow end up on the lowest end of wage earning and job stability. And I just wonder what it would mean to find ways, to find habits of becoming subject to those folks, to use from language from 1 Timothy, of flipping the script of power in the same way that Jesus did. Because that's Jesus' whole gambit, right? To turn the hierarchy of power upside down so the last become first and the leader becomes the servant and God becomes human. Jesus invites us into those kind of habits. Now, Ken Hood, who some of you may know, he's preached here at Rose City Park a handful of times. He actually wrote a whole book called The Irrational Jesus. His point being that Jesus was non-rational. I'm going to distinguish that from anti-rational, but non-rational. And that the very part of him, that very part of him that was non-rational is what allowed him to express divine compassion and a hunger for justice, both of which are not rational. But I think what we learn through our exposure to the presence of Jesus is that they are holy things. And I wonder if there's a way that we could do that too, to direct our love to the least among us rather than demanding love from them. I mean, I think that would be consistent with Jesus' invitation in the gospel to find God among the last and the least. I think it would certainly be a faithful and Christ-like way to reorder our loving thingness toward kingdom ends. I also wonder how doing that might help us to live in peace, not only as a community, but also within ourselves. You know, I notice there's just so much talk in our culture now about finding peace and being at peace and having inner peace, and we're going to have peace, right? And of course, the market is happy to offer so many avenues to find that elusive sense of ease. You can get creams, you can get supplements, you can go to a class, you can meditate, there's lots of things. But I think that the truth is that we live in an anxious world, held perpetually in tension, in part because it's not the world as it should be. And we feel that in some deep part of ourselves. And sometimes I wonder if it's true that we can never truly find peace while participating in a hierarchy that runs so counter to the truth of God's love for all people and all of our shared value and dignity as children of God. We long for the kingdom, and we can't quite find it. As Augustine so famously wrote, our hearts are restless until they find our rest in God. And so I wonder if as we seek new and old ways of orienting ourselves toward that kingdom vision, that perhaps one practice that keeps us grounding is actually subverting these harmful systems that we interact with in the name of peace. Directing our love toward the lost and the least, that in that way we might find ourselves somehow more at home in this upside down world because our compass is correctly directed toward loving God and what God has set before us to love. I really hope for that. I struggle with knowing how to make peace in this big and broken world, and my efforts seem so small. But I ask for God's wisdom to guide me and to train me. And I ask for God's patience and diligence to be with me as I practice new vision and new habits in all these ways as I walk along seeking to make peace. And I would invite just us to be on that journey all together. So I would offer these words in the name of the God who created, redeemed, and sustained us always. Amen.